The lake had always been my sanctuary. Its mirrored surface reflected not just the sky, but the peace I had fought so hard to carve out of the chaos of city life. A week at my cabin, tucked into the dense pines on the northern shore, was enough to strip away the noise, the bills, the endless chatter of people who believed the world owed them something. I never invited many guests. The cabin was mine, and I guarded it like a secret jewel. That's why, when she showed up unannounced, her high heels crunching over the gravel path with that imperious stomp, I knew trouble was coming. The first time I saw her that morning, she was standing in front of my cabin, clipboard in hand, the way a queen might survey a conquered city. Marlene Dunham, president of the Homeowners Association, radiated entitlement like some people radiate warmth. She smiled that kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, the smile that promised disruption and chaos for anyone who dared to defy her. "You're locking yourself away again," she said, tilting her head, eyes scanning my property as if she were appraising livestock. "You know, it's common courtesy to open your cabin when HOA members are here. Guests are expected." "Guests?" I raised a brow. I wasn't aware I was expected to host anyone. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that made the hair on my arms rise. "Oh, you know, our little weekend retreat. We thought it would be lovely if all cabin owners opened their doors for a communal meet and greet. It's tradition." I frowned. I didn't know tradition included forcing someone to hand over their home. Her smile didn't falter. Instead, she leaned closer, as if I were a child refusing her playground rules. "It's not just a suggestion. It's highly frowned upon to lock your cabin against HOA guests." I felt my blood boil, an old, familiar fire igniting. Highly frowned upon. This was extortion dressed in charm. And for a moment, I imagined every polite nod, every understanding homeowner at the association meetings, or the silent compromises, boiling into something explosive. I didn't raise my voice, though. I never did in the face of self-righteous fury. I just shook my head slowly. "I don't care what's frowned upon," I said calmly. "I didn't buy this cabin to host strangers at your whim. The door stays locked." The moment I said it, I realized I had crossed an invisible line. The queen bee's eyes widened, just for a flicker, but it was enough to confirm my suspicion. Marlene Dunham was not a woman used to being denied. She straightened, all cold grace now, and whispered with venom, "You'll regret this." I didn't flinch. I had been threatened before, and words like regret had never worked on me. Yet, as I watched her storm back toward her car, heels clacking like a death march across the driveway, I couldn't help but wonder, what could someone like her do when cornered? How far would she go to punish someone for refusing her command? As the engine roared to life and her car disappeared down the narrow road, a silence settled over the cabin. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I was used to. It was charged, tense, the kind of silence that hangs before a storm. I walked to the deck, gripping the railing, staring at the lake, my reflection fractured by the gentle ripples. That question, how far would she go, kept echoing in my mind. And I realized, maybe for the first time, that this wasn't just a nuisance. This was personal. Weeks before, I had tried to ignore the HOA politics entirely. I paid my dues, followed the rules that made sense, and smiled when required at their annual meetings. But Marlene had a way of finding people who valued their independence too much, who had boundaries she considered inconvenient. And now, I was squarely on her radar. I remembered the stories, whispers about what she did to those who resisted. Cabins mysteriously vandalized, petty fines escalated, threats disguised as polite notes. It seemed absurd at first, the idea that one woman could wield such power over a community of adults. But standing there, watching the lake glint in the afternoon sun, I realized that absurdity was just another word for reality when it came to Marlene Dunham. I poured a glass of whiskey from the cabinet and sat on the edge of the porch, watching the lake. Calm, serene, untouchable. That's when the first plan began to form. Not a plan of negotiation. She'd never listen, but a plan of retaliation. A taste of the frustration she had casually dished out over the years. The cabin, after all, wasn't just wooden nails. It was mine. Every inch was purchased with sweat, years of saving, and the sacrifices I had made to escape a life that demanded compliance. And I realized something important. She had crossed a line. She had assumed entitlement over my property and my peace. That assumption would not go unchallenged. I could almost hear her voice again, crisp and condescending. "You'll regret this." But for the first time, I wondered if the regret might belong to her instead. Was it possible that the person who had always wielded power over others could be stripped of it, one calculated move at a time? I took another sip of whiskey, letting the warmth spread through me, calming the fury that had risen at her insolence. The lake shimmered, endless and patient. Revenge, I realized, required patience, timing, and precision. It wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate. And no, I was deliberate. So, as the sun dipped low and the first shadows stretched across my property, I asked myself a question that would haunt the coming days. What would it take to turn the queen of the HOA into a pawn of her own arrogance? I smiled then, a slow, steady smile. The kind of smile that promised storms. The kind of smile that knew boundaries are being crossed and that every crossed line has a cost. And as the night fell over the lake, the quiet of the cabin was not just calm anymore. It was anticipation, the simmering pause before reckoning. I had no intention of letting her, or anyone, treat me like a doormat. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the sweet, dark thrill of knowing that she would soon find out exactly how wrong she had been. The next morning, the lake seemed unchanged, calm and indifferent, as if it had no memory of yesterday's confrontation. But I knew better. The still surface was a lie. Just beneath it, currents of trouble were already stirring. By sunrise, I began to notice small signs, things too subtle to be accidental. My mailbox had been rifled through. A thin scratch marked the front door frame, barely noticeable unless you looked closely. And the tire tracks in the gravel, the way one set looped oddly around my driveway, told me she had been here again after I went to bed. Marlene Dunham didn't accept no for an answer, and it was becoming painfully clear she wouldn't simply drop her grievance. The HOA president wasn't just a bureaucrat. She was a predator in sensible clothing, using authority as a weapon. And worse, she thrived on making people feel helpless before her. I had been underestimating her, until now. I sat on the deck, notebook in hand, cataloging everything, obsessively. Threats, trespasses, small act of intimidation, they all formed a pattern. The scratching at the door, classic psychological harassment. The scattered mail, a warning. We know you're here. We can reach you anytime. Her name hovered at the edges of my thoughts, and I couldn't shake the image of a triumphant, sharp-heeled walk back to her car, confident that I had no choice but to submit. But that's where she was wrong. That's where every mistake she ever made would cost her. I decided I needed intelligence first. I couldn't react blindly. For 2 days, I monitored the area, noting her comings and goings. I learned her schedule, her preferred routes, even how long she lingered near other cabins before retreating. Her car, a glossy black SUV that always seemed to glint in the sun, was an easy marker. I even memorized the rhythm of her heels on gravel, a little trick I would later use to my advantage. By the third morning, I was ready, and then it happened. A knock at the door. Sharp, deliberate, unmistakably Marlene. My stomach didn't flinch. Anger had replaced fear, but my pulse ticked like a clock preparing for war. I opened the peephole. There she was, clipboard raised, lips pressed in that same smug line. "I told you, you can't just ignore community requests," she said, without even attempting pleasantries. "I told you, my cabin isn't part of any social experiment," I replied, voice calm but firm. "You can leave." She leaned closer, and I saw the calculation in her eyes. The flicker of irritation that passed over her face when someone refused her was always brief but telling. "You think this is over? This is just the beginning. You're going to regret your stubbornness." I knew she meant it. Over the next week, Marlene's strikes became more obvious. Someone keyed, "Open up or else," into my mailbox. My dock had its ropes cut and tied into tight knots that looked menacing, though no damage was done. Late at night, I caught shadows moving near the cabin windows, but whenever I confronted them, they vanished into the pines. It was harassment, psychological warfare, the kind that slowly wears down your confidence until compliance seems like the only option. But I wasn't going to comply. Instead, I started planning. Revenge, I realized, required patience, precision, and careful observation. Each action she took was a clue about her personality, her arrogance, her weaknesses. I began small, testing her reactions. I moved the gate to my property just a few inches, enough to trip her SUV tires slightly the next time she swung by. She stormed off, muttering, but didn't escalate immediately. Then I left a trail of subtle accidents near her preferred walking path to the lake, fallen branches, misplaced signage, a few harmless but startling noises in the night. Her fury was visible, but she hadn't yet realized it was being directed at her own ego, manipulated. And then came the message. A handwritten note, pinned to my cabin door. You think this is clever, but cleverness doesn't save you. You will learn respect. Respect. That word burned in me more than her threats ever could. She believed that fear was respect. That was her weakness. She didn't understand the subtle art of leverage, the way patience and foresight could dismantle someone's authority from within. I started keeping a journal, documenting every interaction, every sighting of her car, every message. Each line was a stepping stone for what I planned next. Revenge wasn't about brute force. It was about control, about turning the predator into prey. Then the community meeting came, the very one she had been pushing for, which I had no intention of attending. I watched from the shadows as she presided over the room like a queen among serfs, dictating who could speak and when. The other cabin owners were nervous, hesitant, eager to please. And there she was, Marlene Dunham, smug, convinced she had already won. But her downfall began quietly, almost imperceptibly. I noticed how she relied on certain people to support her rulings, and how easily they could be manipulated or misled. With the right information, carefully planted, the whole hierarchy could wobble. It was just a matter of time before cracks appeared. I started small, anonymous notes to her allies, innocuous tips that would subtly undermine her credibility. A misfiled document here, a rumor planted there. Slowly, the seeds of doubt were sown. People began to question her decisions, whisper about inconsistencies. And all the while, I remained unseen, the invisible hand guiding her into a web of her own making. At home, at the cabin, I began building physical defenses too. Cameras hidden among the trees, motion sensors disguised as rocks, lights rigged to turn on in patterns that would startle anyone approaching at night. Every move she made, I would know. Every attempt at intimidation, I would turn back on her. By the end of the week, I realized I wasn't just preparing for defense. I was orchestrating the beginning of her undoing. Marlene had underestimated me. She had assumed I was just another timid homeowner who would open her door when commanded, smile politely, and nod through her authoritarian nonsense. She had assumed wrong. That night, as the wind rustled through the pines and the lake reflected the moon's cold light, I sat on the porch with a map of her territory. Every cabin, every favorite path, every route she took for her inspections was marked. I traced the lines with my finger, imagining how her frustration would grow when things no longer went according to her plan. She wouldn't see it coming, because she couldn't fathom a resistance that operated quietly, deliberately, with patience. Revenge was no longer just a thought. It was a strategy. And strategy, I knew, would win where anger alone could not. The question that had haunted me the first day lingered still. What would it take to turn the queen of the HOA into a pawn of her own arrogance? Now, I had an answer. It would take time, manipulation, and precision, every ounce of cunning I possessed. And I was ready. The game had begun, and for the first time, I felt the thrill of control. Marlene Dunham had entered my world thinking she could dictate the rules. But I was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't authority. It's patience, and the willingness to let someone dig their own trap. And when the trap snapped, I promised myself there would be no mercy. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and the distant tang of the lake. It should have been serene, a typical day at the cabin, but I could feel the tension in my chest, a low hum of anticipation. Marlene's latest harassment had crossed a line. A broken lantern on the porch, its glass shattered, and a note tucked into the remnants. Open the cabin, or you will face consequences you cannot escape. I had laughed, a slow, quiet laugh that made me feel both alive and dangerously alive. She thought she could intimidate me. She thought a few shattered objects and veiled threats would bend my will. But all she had done was fuel the fire that had been smoldering since our first encounter. For days, I had been observing, noting her routes, studying her habits, planting tiny inconsistencies in the perceptions of her allies. And now, it was time for the first real strike. I left the cabin at dawn, moving silently along the narrow trails that wound through the forest. Every step was deliberate. I had marked her usual route to check on other homeowners' cabins, the one she always took when she wanted to appear in control. Today, I would be waiting. Hours later, I spotted her through the trees, heels clicking on the gravel, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning like a hawk. She had no idea I was watching, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I began with something subtle. A small but noticeable sign near her path, one she relied on for guidance, had been misplaced. I knew she would notice it, and I knew it would frustrate. Within minutes, her pace quickened, her expression tightening as she looked around, confused, muttering under her breath. From my vantage point, hidden in the shadows, I could see the first cracks forming. Her confident facade began to crumble, replaced by irritation, and that, I realized, was a key. Marlene thrived on control, on the illusion that she was untouchable. But when control slipped through her fingers, she became reckless, and recklessness could be exploited. I had prepared for her reaction. Small, harmless accidents that seemed coincidental to anyone else would now target her ego directly. A strategically placed branch that caused her to trip slightly, papers scattering in the wind just as she tried to assert authority with the homeowners she visited. Each incident was carefully timed, designed to sow doubt in her mind and discomfort in her body. By midday, she was visibly flustered. I could hear her muttering complaints into her phone, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Her allies, normally quick to nod and agree, now hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The carefully planted seeds of doubt were taking root. I returned to the cabin, a slow smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. The lake reflected the afternoon sun, calm and silent, indifferent to the human drama unfolding nearby. But I was far from indifferent. I had orchestrated the first wave of my plan, and it was working beautifully. That evening, a community meeting was scheduled, one I had been avoiding. I wasn't going to attend as myself, not yet. Instead, I observed from a distance, blending in with a crowd of homeowners who had come seeking updates and guidance. From my concealed position, I watched Marlene enter the room, radiating authority as usual. But there was a difference this time. The subtle disruptions, the planted doubts, had begun to erode her confidence. Her usual sharp gaze wavered, her voice faltered slightly when she spoke, and small, nervous glances were exchanged among the homeowners. It was a minor victory, but significant. For the first time, Marlene's power seemed vulnerable, and I felt a surge of satisfaction. Revenge wasn't about immediate destruction. It was about precision, patience, and timing. And I was already several moves ahead. As the meeting progressed, I introduced a small piece of information anonymously, a minor discrepancy in the HOA's records, one that only a few would notice, but enough to cause confusion. I watched as Marlene tried to address it, her frustration mounting with each misstep. The homeowners, previously passive, began questioning her decisions, voicing concerns she hadn't anticipated. I stayed in the shadows, a silent observer, letting the chaos unfold. Every falter, every hesitation, was a testament to the cracks I had begun to expose. By the time the meeting ended, whispers followed her as she left the room, her confidence shaken, her authority quietly undermined. That night, I returned to the cabin, my heart still racing from the day's events. I knew this was only the beginning. Marlene was clever, manipulative, and relentless, but she had underestimated me, and that mistake would be her undoing. I reviewed my notes, cataloging every reaction, every flinch, every moment of uncertainty. Each detail was a weapon, a tool I could use to dismantle her carefully constructed image of control. I began to plan the next phase, the one that would take my revenge from subtle manipulation to undeniable impact. The next morning, I found another note pinned to my door, this one more direct. "Stop this. You don't know who you're dealing with." I smiled. Oh, I knew exactly who I was dealing with. And now, I knew exactly how to respond. My plan involved more than just minor disruptions. It required a careful orchestration of events that would force Marlene into mistakes, expose her arrogance, and ultimately turn her own tactics against her. I began preparing materials, gathering evidence, and crafting scenarios that would leave her scrambling, questioning her decisions, and most importantly, vulnerable. For the next few days, I set traps both literal and figurative. Cameras hidden along her paths, small but effective annoyances at her favorite spots, and carefully timed misinformation spread among her allies. Each action was calculated, designed to frustrate, confuse, and destabilize. By the end of the week, the results were undeniable. Marlene's confidence had eroded further, her authority questioned openly by homeowners who once followed her without hesitation. I watched from the shadows as she tried to regain control, only to stumble into the carefully laid traps I had set. It was exhilarating, intoxicating even, to see someone so powerful falter. But I remained focused, disciplined, knowing that true revenge required more than satisfaction. It required completion. And the real work was only beginning. As I sat on the porch that night, the lake reflecting the moonlight, I realized how far I had come in such a short time. Marlene had underestimated me, and in doing so, she had given me the opportunity to take control. The first blow had been struck. The game had shifted, and I was no longer just defending my cabin. I was orchestrating a reckoning. And when it was finished, Marlene would understand exactly what it meant to crush someone who refused to be intimidated. For now, I allowed myself a small smile, a moment of quiet satisfaction. The lake remained calm, serene, indifferent to the human drama unfolding on its shores. But I was anything but indifferent. My plan was in motion, and the first signs of its success were already evident. The question that had haunted me since the beginning remained, but now it carried a new urgency. How far could I push her before she finally realized the trap she was in? And deep down, I knew the answer didn't matter. Because when she did realize, it would be too late. By the time the leaves started turning gold along the lakeshore, Marlene Dunham was no longer walking like a queen. She still wore the same sharp suits. She still carried the clipboard like a badge of authority. But something about her had shifted. The slight hesitation before speaking. The way her eyes flicked around rooms, scanning for danger. The subtle tremor in her perfectly manicured hands. She felt it. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid, and I was the one shaking it. It started with the audit. Every HOA had one eventually, a routine review of finances, paperwork, and organizational transparency. Normally, these things were dull, procedural events that barred everyone into silence. But this time, it wasn't routine at all, because I made sure it wasn't. Using the information I gathered over weeks, missing documents, altered dates, polytrack fines, I quietly sent an anonymous but very detailed report to the Regional HOA Oversight Committee. I didn't lie. I didn't invent anything. I simply highlighted what had been carefully ignored for years. Marlene had built her empire on shortcuts. Now, those shortcuts were being traced. The first sign of panic came in a bright yellow envelope taped to my mailbox. Cease all actions against the HOA or face legal consequences. I laughed so hard I had to sit down on the porch steps. She thought she could scare me by pretending she knew it was me. She didn't know anything. A week later, the auditors arrived. 2 men in neutral suits, polite voices, and eyes that missed nothing. They asked questions. They requested files. They pulled boxes from storage. And for the first time since I'd moved here, I saw Marlene stumble in public. Her confidence cracked. No one informed me of this, she said sharply, arms folded. One of the auditors smiled thinly. That's interesting. According to our records, you signed the notification. Silence. Thick, heavy, delicious silence. And then came the rumors. People started whispering. Not about me. About her. Where had the extra fees gone? Why were some homeowners fined double while others weren't fined at all? Why did her friends' cabins get approved for expansions instantly while everyone else waited months? I didn't have to push anymore. The community did it for me. Marlene started losing allies. The same people who once nodded along now avoided eye contact. The same hands that helped her pass rules now folded across chest in doubt. Power doesn't disappear all at once. It leaks. Slowly, quietly, painfully, and she felt every drop. One evening, as dusk folded over the lake, she came to my cabin, not with a clipboard this time, not with threats. She knocked, softly. I didn't answer at first. I watched through the camera I had hidden in the pines. She looked different, smaller, tired, frightened. She knocked again. "I just want to talk," she called. Her voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't commanding. It was cracked. I opened the door. You don't understand power until you see someone who thinks they still have it standing on your doorstep, begging without realizing they are begging. "You've made your point," she said, straightening her jacket, trying to regain control. "Whatever game you're playing, it needs to stop. This community doesn't need chaos." I stepped aside, letting the door open wider. Calm, silent, patient. "I didn't create chaos," I said quietly. "You did. I just stopped pretending it wasn't there." Her eyes hardened. "You have no proof." I smiled. That scared her more than anything I could have shouted. The next week, the second phase began. The community demanded a meeting, not the kind Marlene controlled. The kind where she had to answer questions she couldn't dodge. The room was packed. People didn't sit quietly anymore. They stood. They spoke over one another. They demanded explanations. And she stood at the front, exposed. "No one has filed formal complaints before now," she said defensively. A man near the back laughed. "Because we were scared to." That sentence hit the room like a hammer. She wasn't dealing with ignorance anymore. She was dealing with awareness, and awareness is dangerous. Every answer she gave sounded rehearsed. Every denial felt hollow. Every forced smile looked like a crack waiting to split. And all I had to do was sit in the back row and watch her sweat. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to accuse. The truth was doing that for me. But the real turning point came 3 nights later. I found her by the lake. She didn't know I was there at first. She stood at the water's edge, staring at her reflection, shoulders tight like she was holding herself together with sheer willpower. "You're enjoying this," she said without turning around. I stayed silent. "I built all of this," she continued. "Order, structure. No one cared before I took charge." I finally spoke. "You built control, not order." She turned to face me, and for the first time, I didn't see an HOA president. I saw a woman terrified of being powerless. "Stop," she said. "Just tell me what you want." I stepped closer, but not enough to invade her space. Not enough to threaten. Power doesn't need closeness to be felt. "I already got what I wanted," I said. "My cabin, my boundaries, my peace." She searched my face, and finally understood. She was no longer in charge. From that night on, everything accelerated. Formal complaints were filed. Committees were formed. Special reviews were announced. And Marlene, she started missing meetings. She stopped walking the trails. Her SUV stayed parked. Her throne wasn't smashed. It was abandoned. And that was worse, because when power is taken from someone slowly, publicly, and quietly, they don't get a dramatic fall. They just fade. That night, sitting on my porch, watching the lake glow silver under the moon, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not victory. Calm. She had come for my peace. She had tried to take what wasn't hers. And now, she was learning what it felt like to lose control of something she thought she owned. And the best part? I hadn't broken a single rule. I had only let the truth breathe. As the wind moved through the trees and the lake lapped softly at the shore, I knew the final act was coming. And when it did, she wouldn't be ready. By the time the first frost dusted the lake, Marlene Dunham's empire had begun to crumble. Her once imposing presence at the HOA meetings had diminished in nervous nods, her confident voice replaced by forced, clipped sentences. Even her closest allies now whispered behind her back, exchanging glances that carried doubt. Every carefully constructed boundary she had imposed on the community was eroding. And yet, she didn't surrender. She couldn't. Pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, she grew dangerous. Her desperation became palpable. I could feel it in the tension in the air, in the hurried footsteps I occasionally heard on the gravel, in the hurried phone calls she made with low voices and harsh tones. For someone who had thrived on control, losing it wasn't just embarrassing, it was unbearable. And when pride battles reality, irrationality follows. One night, I noticed a SUV parked unusually long by the edge of the woods near my property. From my hidden camera, I saw her pacing, muttering under her breath, clipboard abandoned on the passenger seat. That was the first time I realized she might try something reckless. And I welcomed the thought. The next morning, as dawn painted the lake in muted gold, I found my dock lines cut. Not just tangled, but partially severed, a clear escalation. Whoever had done this had no concern for subtlety. It was a message, and Marlene's handwriting, or, more accurately, her signature style, was all over it, bold, aggressive, impatient. I didn't panic. I smiled. Revenge isn't about responding to emotion. It's about anticipation. I spent the morning inspecting the dock, noting the damage, and then calmly making temporary repairs. Meanwhile, I left a small, inconspicuous trail of clues pointing back to a pattern of behavior. A misplaced tool here, a subtle mark of her tires in the gravel there, enough that anyone paying attention would see a trail, yet never know the real orchestrator. By midday, the community was buzzing. Everyone knew something had happened at my cabin, and all eyes were on the HOA president. She tried to deflect, attempted to appear composed, but the cracks in her veneer were unmistakable. A few homeowners voiced concerns openly, questioning her oversight, wondering why she hadn't prevented such reckless acts from escalating. Her desperation had reached a point where logic no longer guided her. She began calling me directly. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, was strained and pleading. "I need to talk to you," she said during one call. This needs to stop. You don't understand the consequences you're inviting." "I understand perfectly," I replied evenly. "You overstepped." I responded. "That's all." Her breath hitched, frustration barely contained. "This isn't personal. You don't know what you're doing." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," I said. "And it's working." After that conversation, I knew it wouldn't be long before she acted recklessly in public, and I had been waiting for this. I orchestrated the next stage with precision. During the following community meeting, I had prepared a small display of the HOA's discrepancies, copies of records, charts showing inconsistencies, photographs of improperly approved work, all arranged anonymously, designed to speak louder than any accusation. Marlene entered the room expecting compliance, expecting her usual deference. But as the documents appeared before the crowd, murmurs erupted. Whispers turned into pointed questions. She stammered. She tried to regain control, attempting explanations, but the evidence spoke louder than her rehearsed statements. The final blow came when one homeowner, previously loyal, asked, "Why didn't you approve my expansion when others were allowed it?" Marlene froze. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She had no answer that could withstand scrutiny. I watched silently from the back of the room. Every flush on her face, every faltering sentence, was a testament to the careful, patient work that had brought her to this point. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. The dominoes had been lined up perfectly. All that remained was a final push. And that push came the following morning. I discovered her car parked at the edge of the woods again, but this time it wasn't idle. Through the hidden camera, I watched her move frantically, attempting to tamper with my property, my gates, my signage, even small attempt to cut or loosen the ropes on the dock. She was panicked, overextending herself, desperate to regain some measure of control. I approached silently, careful to remain hidden in the shadows until the moment was right. As she crouched to cut one of the ropes, I called out calmly, "Marlene." She jumped, spinning around with a startled yelp. For a moment, I could see the fear in her eyes. Not fear of me physically, but fear of the situation she had created for herself. "This isn't going to work," I said, my voice low, measured. "Every action you've taken has only confirmed what the others already see." Her shoulders slumped. Frustration and panic battled for dominance in her expression. You can't do this," she whispered. It's mine. All of it. My authority." I stepped closer. Calm. Certain. "It's not yours because authority isn't ownership. You tried to control what wasn't yours, and now everyone knows it. You've made your choice." For a moment, she said nothing, breathing hard, trapped by her own desperation. Then, as the sun caught the lake, glinting across the water, she finally dropped the pretense. I don't know what to do, she admitted, voice trembling. And that was when I knew the game was truly won. Not with destruction, not with confrontation, but with exposure, with patience, with a quiet unraveling of a person who believed they could dominate others without consequence. The following days confirmed it. Marlene began avoiding public scrutiny. Meetings were canceled or postponed, often with excuses that barely masked panic. She no longer visited cabins unannounced. Homeowners approached me instead, seeking guidance, offering support, or simply sharing relief that someone had finally stood up to her. And through it all, I remained steady. The cabin, my sanctuary, had been defended. My boundaries had been enforced. And the architect of fear, the woman who had once controlled everyone with her sharp heels and clipboard, had been undone. For the first time since the conflict began, I allowed myself a moment of peace. Watching the lake shimmer in the late autumn sun, I realized that revenge wasn't just about satisfaction. It was about reclaiming power, restoring balance, and proving that even the most formidable opponents can fall when patience, strategy, and resolve are on your side. Marlene had been a storm, but storms pass. And the lake remained, serene and indifferent, reflecting only what was true. And I was still here. Winter had begun to creep into the forest, frosting the pine needles and stiffening the early morning air. The lake, once vibrant and shimmering, now lay under a thin sheet of ice, reflecting a muted, silver sky. Everything about the cabin felt quieter, slower, and somehow victorious. I had weathered Marlene Dunham's storm, and now it was time to see it fully collapse. Marlene had been retreating ever since the last incident. Her frantic attempt to intimidate me had backfired spectacularly. The HOA members no longer followed her unquestioningly. Her credibility had been dismantled, piece by piece, like a house of cards buffeted by a patient wind. She was a shadow of the woman who had once commanded attention and fear with a glance. The final act came unexpectedly, during what was supposed to be a routine HOA meeting. I didn't attend, but I had orchestrated it from the shadows. As always, anonymous tips, evidence files, and carefully timed leaks had done their work. Marlene arrived, hoping to regain some control, but the room had changed. Homeowners were no longer hesitant. They had questions. They had expectations. And most importantly, they had courage. As the meeting began, murmurs filled the room. Someone had prepared a presentation, charts, receipts, photographs, all pointing to years of mismanagement, favoritism, and questionable decision-making, and every piece of it had Marlene's fingerprints. She tried to speak, tried to defend herself, but each sentence was met with polite but firm skepticism. Her words fell flat. The room was no longer hers command. A homeowner stood up. "We've waited too long for accountability. Why did you approve project for your friends but deny the rest of us?" Marlene's face tightened. For the first time, her composure faltered entirely. She opened her mouth to respond, hesitated, and closed it again. Whispers spread through the room. Allies exchanged uncomfortable glances. The power she had wielded for years, the carefully cultivated authority that made neighbors fearful and compliant, was gone. By the end of the meeting, it was official. A vote had been called for her removal. It was unanimous. Even those who had once supported her could no longer deny the evidence, the mounting dissatisfaction, or the fear that had been exposed. Marlene had fallen, not because of force, not because of confrontation, but because truth, carefully applied, always finds its mark. I watched the news later from my cabin, not from the shadows this time, but openly. It wasn't me in the headlines, but the result was mine. Marlene's resignation had been announced, her control relinquished. The HOA would be reorganized. New leadership, fairer processes, and transparency were promised. And the woman who had once stood above everyone, untouchable and ruthless, had finally been toppled. Her downfall was complete, but I wanted more than her resignation. I wanted to ensure she learned the full cost of her arrogance. I had prepared one final move. A small package arrived at her doorstep, carefully timed to reach her just after her resignation announcement. Inside were photographs, printed clearly and marked with dates, evidence of every act of intimidation, harassment, and trespass she had attempted against me. Alongside the photos was a note, typed and professional. Consider this a record of actions that cross boundaries. Authority does not grant ownership of others' lives. Let this be a lesson, not a threat. Learn respect. It's your only path forward. It was calm. It was precise. It didn't scream vengeance. But it left her knowing, in no uncertain terms, that her reign of fear had consequences. I watched from the lake that evening, sitting on my porch with a warm cup of coffee, the cold air sharp on my cheeks. The reflection of the winter sky on the icy water mirrored the serenity I finally felt. No one had to know I had orchestrated it all, but I didn't care. Revenge had been sweet, not because it was chaotic, but because it was perfectly calculated. I had maintained my peace while dismantling the source of my disruption. The cabin remained mine. My sanctuary was intact. And Marlene, the woman who had tried to dictate my life, had been humbled completely. Her arrogance had blinded her. Her reliance on fear as a weapon had been her undoing. And I, patient and deliberate, had shown her that power taken without respect is power that cannot stand. As night fell and the stars reflected on the still lake, I finally allowed myself to lean back and breathe fully. The tension that had coiled inside me for weeks, months even, began to unwind. Every surveillance camera, every plan, every subtle manipulation had led to this moment. And it was perfect. I thought back to the first confrontation, to her imperious demand that I open my cabin, to the sharp words, the veiled threats. She had believed she could force me to comply, that my boundaries were trivial, that her authority was absolute. And now, she had learned, too late, that boundaries aren't just rules. They are the very measure of respect between people. The snow began to fall lightly, dusting the pine branches, blanketing the cabin in quiet white. The lake, frozen at its edges, mirrored the sky like a giant silver mirror. My reflection was calm, steady, satisfied. I had won, not by brute force or anger, but by patience, strategy, and resolve. I had reclaimed my life, my sanctuary, and my peace. And somewhere, in the chaos she had created and now lost, Marlene Dunham would remember the lesson forever. Authority can be taken. Control can be broken. And sometimes, the most satisfying revenge is not in destruction. It is in watching someone dismantle themselves, piece by piece, under the weight of their own hubris. The lake whispered its quiet approval. I was home, and she was finished.